Welcome to the Sourcing Hero podcast, produced by Una, a group purchasing organization that empowers sourcing heroes, and Art of Procurement, the world's largest procurement podcast network. I'm your host, Kelly Barner. The goal of the Sourcing Hero podcast is to capture the epic stories of people who are rising up and beating the odds to create exceptional value within procurement, directly from those heroes themselves. Today, my guest here on the Sourcing Hero podcast is Kris Lance. Kris is Vice President and General Manager at Una, a group purchasing organization and the home of the Sourcing Hero. Kris joins me every month to tackle a current news story or a topic of interest from his own point of view. So, hi, Kris. Happy February. Thank you for being back.
Hey, here I am. Happy February, Kelly.
So I'm going to start with a really big question and we'll go from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should the United States buy Greenland?
Absolutely not. If you just my opinion, absolutely not. But I understand I think I understand what's going on there, though. I don't think even though I think even the latest things I'm seeing, there's still a push around like the purchase of it. I don't think that's the actual angle. Again, I do understand the leverage, the importance of the area, why we would want to buy it, but buy it. I mean, I'm saying it with tongue in cheek, but like with what money? Unless we're using,
Right.
Monopoly money or Bitcoin, like I absolutely not. I think we need to put America first, focus on the 50 that we have. Let's clean that up. But again, I say again, all that with an asterisk. Like I definitely understand the importance of the region, and Greenland's going to be a player there. So
It absolutely is. And it's really strange. It's funny when you think about news cycles, it's amazing how quickly we go from either talking about something constantly to all of a sudden realizing, hey, it's been 6 or 8 months and we haven't talked about whatever that was, or going from literally never talking about something to it all of a sudden being in headlines and everybody's coming out and sharing the opinions on it. And that seems like what has been happening with discussions around the Arctic Circle since January. If we think broadly, and you kind of made reference to the region in our joking exchange about Greenland, but what is generally speaking the significance of this region and why it's earning so many headlines?
Well, so I think why it's hitting headlines is because I think of like the boisterous approach, right? And I don't think anybody should be surprised by Trump's approach. I think even when he was in business, I think all his negotiating tactics were perceived as just outrageous. So this isn't new, but we're talking about like the importance of the region and like why we would even be posturing, and that's what I think is going on there. Is I think why this is coming up now is again because of the really in your face claims or offers or proposals, we'll say. But I think in reality, I think the West, the Western hemisphere is really just kind of catching up, I think, to the importance of that region. I mean, even back in 2018, 2017, years ago, Russia started making a massive push and play for that region. So it may be new maybe to us, but I mean, it's really not new. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of resources. And I think it's also, it's like the high ground, right? I think there's military strategic importance as to why that region. And so when you're talking about economies in every headline, potential war or geopolitical relations in every headline, you gotta look north. Not everything is just in the Middle East, or not everything is, right in the more common or regular hot areas, I'll say. And so that's why I think we're talking about it. I think there's a couple factors, and again, I might sound like a broken record, but I think a lot of it is the polarizing proposals, but it's there's a reason behind it. The importance of that region is it's pretty monumental in my opinion. So
yeah, well, it is interesting because you figure anybody that's visionary, big thinker, forward looking, I mean, in order to get anything right, you have to sometimes sound a little bit out there, right? I actually think back to when the Space Force was established. And, I don't follow outer space super closely. I've never totally recovered from Pluto being downgraded from planet to
Seriously.
whatever we downgraded it to.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, okay, Space Force, and you're thinking, that sounds like a Seth MacFarlane comedy.
Mhm.
And then you find out what they're going to do, and you think, right, SpaceX and Starlink and all of the different companies, even the like the passenger quasi space travel, Blue Horizon, and all that.
Oh yeah.
That's you're thinking, okay, but so if we're putting significant investment and sending people up there, we have to start to think about who's in charge of policing up there and making the rules. And I think the Arctic is becoming something like that. So when okay, I'm starting to hear this in the headlines a lot. I went back and I pulled some headlines from people that know a heck of a lot more about this region than me to figure out geopolitically, why is this so critical? So here are a few
Mhm.
facts that I pulled that I really do think make the case around the significance of the region.
Mhm.
So when you look at the distance between Alaska and Russia, they're
Mhm.
only 53 miles apart at the Bering Strait.
Mhm.
And I know for me, so I know I'm almost exactly 40 miles to Boston. 13 miles further isn't actually all that far. How would I feel if on a complicated day, Russia was just 13 miles further away than Boston is from me? Okay, like now you've got my attention if they're
Right.
playing in the region. But in case that wasn't enough to make people nervous, in 2023 and 2024, we had the Russian and Chinese navies patrolling around Alaska, then
Mm.
the Russian and Chinese bombers flying near Alaska. Okay, that's getting even less comfortable. Now you're with your Navy and your bombers between me and Boston. That's not a great feeling.
Right.
And of course, we hear about Russia's shadow fleet. They've got incentives to bring oil to China. Um, we added Sweden and Finland to NATO, right, which is starting to move in that region
Mm.
and make Russia concerned about who's in NATO. But then NORAD. So now, Kris, when I hear about NORAD,
Mhm.
I instantly think about the Santa tracker.
Oh yeah.
This
Yeah.
is not really my this
That's
is
not
not
what its
really my area. So
primary
when I
use
think
is.
exactly, I'm like, okay, we're totally on top of Santa's location
Mhm.
24 hours a year. But how up to date are the data, the operations, the equipment for the other 364 days a year? Maybe for people that are just as important as Santa, but in a more scary way.
Mhm.
There is a lot going on in this region when we start to think about the geopolitical angle. And there's some scary names in there, right? You start talking about China and Russia and their militaries, you
Mhm.
can feel where the temperature is going up.
Yep. Yep. You absolutely can. So what's kind of catching my attention in that region is almost exactly what you said. So primarily like the two powerhouses in Russia and China. But it's like really what grabbed me by the chin was like, how did I miss this when we've been talking about all this BRICS stuff, right? And so
Right.
when you start factoring in, it's like the game of telephone, like my friend of my friend, and I know this person. Gets big in a hurry. So I'm also factoring in even North Korea, right? Because they've been running
True.
patrols with China and Russia, and so that, yeah, there's a lot that could go on there, and that's actually what caught my attention is those three getting closer than they've ever been before. And the reality is like when I stop and I say, well, where are the United States like true, real alliances where we're patrolling and doing things like joint efforts like that together? It's a little concerning. Also to your point, like NORAD, like it is pretty out of date. I mean, if
Yeah.
Santa's moving hypersonic, could we track him? Like
Could we lose Santa?
exactly. So all those things, yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to consider, and then whether it's sanctions and other things like that, like what's the point of rolling those types of things out if you can't monitor, right? And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Shadow fleets delivering oil to China. Yeah, just there's a lot to unpack there. So,
And certainly, you and I talk about it all the time. You almost can't be in procurement, supply chain, frankly, almost anywhere in business and not have one ear to geopolitics these days. I mean,
mhm,
so much is going on, especially as companies have bigger footprints globally. I think I really noticed it when Russia initially attacked Ukraine, and all of these really large companies had to make the decision like, okay, do we pull McDonald's out of Russia, or do we pull the Starbucks out? Like all these really large companies had to figure out, oh my goodness, now we're playing on both sides of a front line in a global conflict. But there are some things that literally directly affect our supply chains. And some of this comes from the constantly shifting ocean trade routes around the globe. So I know people very closely track sort of polar ice caps and how melting is changing where ships can and cannot travel. I know there's already a northern sea route and a northwest passage, but it's sounding like the way that the ice cap is shifting, there's a transpolar sea route that would be a completely new path that ships could take. And because, yes, the Houthis have said for now, they're going to stop bothering everybody in the Red Sea.
Right.
I don't think any of the major ocean carriers trust that. I think there's a little bit too much instability in the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel for anybody to send, enormous ocean freight ships through the Red Sea yet. So everybody's always looking for new paths. But again, who is going to keep those paths safe? Who is going to be able to travel through them? I don't know about you, Kris, but until I started digging into this topic, I wasn't really thinking about that from a trade route standpoint versus just the constant static that we've sort of gotten used to between the US, Russia, and China.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm kind of looking at it as like, and really it was your comment just a couple minutes ago that made me think this, but when you were talking about Space Force, right? It's a real good way to look at this as kind of like the new space race or like a new frontier, right?
Yeah.
Because there's like all these lanes or opportunity. I'll just say it that way and be vague, but there's all this opportunity.
Yeah.
I think everybody's trying to jockey for position. Like, well, how do we get there? And because it is still a pretty treacherous area. Like, I mean, I just can't imagine. I mean, we're in Kansas City and we had like a polar vortex come through and it was like -20. I can't imagine that being a warm day. So the areas up there are very treacherous, but like as those ice caps and things start to melt, it'll be interesting to see what routes emerge and then who tries to claim these areas, right? Because it's like, I think Russia has made a claim in some areas that like parts of the sea are kind of like theirs or kind of within like that buffer zone. So yeah, a good way to look at it, at least for me, thinking out loud with you, is kind of like the new frontier or kind of like traveling west to the unknown, right? For opportunity and trade, economics. So that's kind of how I'm looking at and why I think, as a supply chain professional, you need to be kind of watching what's going on because it's also more than just the trade routes. We're talking about critical minerals and materials and elements that may be a game changer, right? For some of these countries. So,
and that is where you really have to start thinking about this differently. And I love that you brought up the minerals and you mentioned a minute ago, who owns the ocean, right? So I'm in Massachusetts. I forget the exact mileage, but it's not far. If you go like so many miles off the coast, you're in quote unquote international waters and sort of nobody's the boss of you. So that's where you take a cute little boat out and you gamble, or people, if they're looking to have a ceremony and spread a loved one's ashes, you go out to international waters and you do that. And so I've always mentally thought of that as no man's land. But if we're getting to the point where we're claiming not just like, okay, this section of ocean right here, this is mine, I'm in charge of this, but it's everything underneath it. And as exploratory and retrieval, what would we say, vessels, technology gets better and better so that you can go down into these places and say, oh, we found a pocket of the rare earth minerals that we need to make all these rechargeable batteries or whatever it is that's going to be in the next iPhone. It is interesting because I'm probably going to butcher this. One of the articles you and I both reviewed in advance of today talked about specifically the Lomonosov. Let me try that again. Lomonosov. I'm betting that's what it is. Lomonosov Ridge.
Sounds good.
But Russia, Canada, and Denmark all say it's theirs. So okay, so who gets to make the decision about whose it actually is? Will there be a fight over it?
Why? Yeah, you almost have to, right? And then it's like just the classic, like it's water, it's fluid, right? So what if
Right.
something floats over? It could get real hot and real hairy so fast because, yeah, you're right. I've always viewed water as like I've always international, like it's kind of like all bets are off. Like anything can kind of happen out there. Nobody has any real authority, and so
Right.
when you start making claims like for things in certain areas, yeah. And I love your point on like how deep, like what's down there. If we're talking about, let's just use China, for example, right? They're starting to restrict their exports on minerals.
Hmm.
Is that why we're making a push? Like, is there something critical that the powers that be know, like, hey, within 10 years, we're going to need silver, cobalt, lithium, like who knows? I don't know. But when you start talking about nuclear power and natural gas and oil, I mean, you're talking big money. And so usually with that, usually there's going to come some military posturing as well.
Right.
Because what I could see is if there's no lines, right? Like you can have a sign, a sign that says you're crossing a border. So what does
Yeah.
that look like in the Atlantic? Is there just a constant fleet just kind of monitoring who's crossing the ocean? Like what do checkpoints look like? So again,
Yeah.
all this, I'm just firing from the hip, but yeah, I think it's definitely something to watch. And more nations, again, because of the headlines, are starting to look to this area like, huh. And I think there's going to be more players that actually enter the space too. Like I don't know, maybe they already have, but like what's Canada have to say? I mean, they're
Yeah.
right up there. So anyways.
And, the thing that's interesting about this, so we've talked a little bit about, things that pop in and out of the headlines,
Mhm.
right? All of a sudden, whoa, Space Force. Okay. All of a sudden, now we're talking about Greenland and the Arctic Circle. And as soon as you start to dig into any one of these areas, you do realize, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I should be worried about this. Like, as you gather the information, the more you learn,
Mhm.
the less crazy it sounds, but also, it feels like it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as it was. And so the next thing that makes me think is, okay, what's the other thing that exists right now that somebody has an eye on, but that hasn't made a headline so that you and I know to go read and find out who's fighting over what in what region? And it might not even be on the earth. We've
Mhm.
talked about the example of Space Force. It could be way beyond. I do think we can zoom all of this back down and apply it in family and personal life, apply it in the office and at work. It's really about making sure we're not limited in our thinking. We're not just focused on the piece of information we're handed or the situation that's in front of us, but we're trying to think, I don't know, bigger picture, higher level. How can we make sure that we're not confined to what's literally right in front of us? Because it denies us the option to be prepared.
It does. It does. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you and I, Kelly, we've been saying this time and time again across a variety of different hot topics. I'll just call them hot topics. And I think what you and I'll toot both of our horns for us, but I think what we both do really well is we're not afraid to be wrong. And I think as long as you have that mindset, what you'll do is you will seek out real, true information. And so
Mhm.
to make sure you're not limited in your thinking, there's really two things that I like intentionally try to do. And so one of them is just really challenge yourself to view things that you normally wouldn't. Meaning like your sources, or maybe an unpopular, like, if you tend to lean to the right, well, read information from the left. If you
That's
lean
right.
to the left, read information from the right. And I think that just even if you're just set out to have a debate, at the worst, it's going to equip you with like real good information. But I think it helps you have a different perspective just on life, as long as you're truly viewing it from another person's perspective, or at least genuinely attempting to. Um, the other thing I do is like, that saying, right, where it's like, keep your friends close, but keep your enemies
Mhm.
closer. So it absolutely baffles me how many people don't read international or other countries' news. And so for
That is a
me,
great point.
I do read, and now maybe some of those countries, maybe I take it with a grain of salt, but I read that information. I'm not saying everybody go out today and pick up Russia Today. There's going to be all your source of truth.
Or Denmark tomorrow.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the China Times. Like I'm absolutely not saying that, but their view, their perspective, their plans, their intentions are usually pretty forthcoming in that headlines, at least the theme. So that's how I try to make sure I'm not limited in my thinking is what is going on in the world. And even more specifically, if you really want to get granular, go and find the events that are happening that nobody in the West, our media is touching at all. Go find out that event and then go find the information, because again, you're not going to do anything but learn. And so that's what I would recommend. That's actually what I do, but you can't go through the motions with it. It's painful. Like it's hard to do because you have to truly try to understand the information. But that's my recommendation. So.
No, and I think it's a great suggestion. I think more information is always more. Different perspectives, if nothing else, is going to confirm how you already feel, right? You might even walk away with something different to think about. And that really is what we try to do in these conversations. Let's go from, food to supply, to changes in currency, to what's happening in the Arctic, to hopefully pull some of those things that are a little bit more peripheral onto people's radar screen. Now, Kris, if this is the first episode of the Sourcing Hero you've joined me for that people are listening into, and they would like to learn more about you or to get in touch, what is the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so the best way to get in touch with me is send me an email. That's Kris, Kris, @una.com. If you're just looking for more information though about me, actually what I'll refer you to is probably episode 200. If this is your first episode, go back and listen to episode 200. You'll learn a little bit more about me, about our CEO and managing partner, Anthony Clarvey, but then also the culture of Una, what we're trying to do and things like that. I am on LinkedIn. Just make sure you spell Kris with a K, Kris. You can get in touch with me that way too.
And if people are curious, episode 200 is available in video. Yes. So people can also watch and see you and see Anthony and see me, and see the beautiful studio that you guys were in. Yep. Kris, another great conversation. Thank you for being back. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sourcing Hero podcast. Join us again next time for more true stories of sourcing and business heroism performed by your colleagues and peers. Look for the Sourcing Hero wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe. Finally, don't forget, sourcing heroism is taking place all around us every day. Keep your eyes open and you're bound to see it. Until next time, I'm your host, Kelly Barner. Stay well and always remember that you can be a hero too.